a brief introduction to Photovoice, and I'll give you a brief introduction to myself as we go through the presentation as well. And just to kind of start with, it's I just wanted to thank the Real Farming Trust and Jade. Really appreciate this opportunity just to kind of talk about Photovoice.
Okay, so the first bit is a little bit of introduction around your hopes and interests and concerns around using Photovoice. And you may want to use Photovoice for evaluations or more generally. So I just thought it'd be nice to have a bit of a go around, because we have a bit of time and we don't have too many people here. So we could just have a quick go around. And people who would like to speak, it'd be great if you could. If you don't really want to speak, that's fine as well. So they're just about.
Hi, I'm Wendy. I work at the Joe Cox Foundation. I'm an evaluation and monitoring manager, so I'm just interested in anything that we might be able to use, especially on big sort of community projects.
Brilliant. Would you like to pass it on to someone?
Rebecca.
Me as Rebecca, normally Bex. I work at Community Gardens in Nottingham, and we do a lot of monitoring, different kind of methods of monitoring, and just interested to see if there's a better way of doing it for our participants. Can't see, I'm on my phone, so I can't see people very well. Ben?
Hi there, I'm Ben Messer from Food Matters and the Sustainable Food Places programme. I'm really interested. I think I'm very into participatory approaches and inclusion and representation of different voices. This seems to tick a lot of those boxes. Concerns are around sort of ownership of what is produced, the images, and possibly a little bit about, is this actually a failure in our ability to listen to people properly? I'll also say, it's important what happens after. It's great capturing images and stories, but what happens to that? You have to act on it once you've heard. That's my bit.
Great, thank you. Would you like to pass it to somebody then?
Yeah, I will pass to Hannah Lyons-Tsai.
Hi, hello. So I work in social research, mainly as a freelancer, but I've been working with charities and public sector, just really interested in participatory methods. I've not come across and used this one before, so excited to be here. I will pass it to Rob Wannerton.
Thank you. I think I've turned my microphone on. So yeah, marvellous, well done. I work for the Real Farming Trust on the LEAP programme, which is the loan financing and also grants attached to loans. So twofold. One is I'm interested to see how we could maybe use this as another tool with the businesses we're working with and helping them to assess their social impact. Also, through our history of work with CAWR, we're working on the social impact toolkit and helping to see again how this might fit into the tools that are already in there, and how we can work to support more awareness of that, particularly with community food businesses. And I choose Callum.
Hi everyone, I'm Callum. I'm from the Community Kitchen, part of the Brighton and Hove Food Partnership. We run a lot of community courses, cookery courses for people. And just a better way to get more evaluation, specifically from groups such as adults with learning disabilities, or from people that English isn't their first language. For example, we work with a lot of refugees and asylum seekers. So making sure that we can get good evaluation about how our cookery courses are going and how we can improve and what people are getting from them. And I will pass it to, sorry, I'm trying to see, Libby.
Hiya, I'm Libby, also from the Brighton Hove Food Partnership. I work with lots of different groups, a bit like Callum. I'm also just looking at trying to get sort of more detail and more information from people and different ways of evaluating. I think my concern would be too many photos sort of being collected and sort of getting a bit lost with how much is collected.
Yeah. Thank you.
I will pass on to who's not been. Tesney, Claire, have you been?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm Tesney, I lead the communications at the Food Ethics Council, but I'm also doing a bit of work down at St Werburgh City Farm in Bristol. We're undergoing like a community consultation at the moment to inform our 3-year strategy. So I'm quite interested in how these sort of alternative participatory approaches could be used to gather information about what matters to the community in a way that's a bit more interesting than just surveys. I guess a question or concern for me would be around sort of technology required and like infrastructure and like financial barriers to that. I will pass over to, not sure who hasn't been yet, Louise Pernell.
Oh, hello. Hi, yeah, I actually might need to go quite soon, but I've done quite a lot of video things before, I've done lots of, but I just would like to know a little bit more about it, basically. So, I don't know about concerns because I don't know terribly much yet about it, but yeah, there would just be normal concerns of that probably people have already said. So, yeah, we're doing a large project with intergenerational project, so it just might be an interesting way to add into our evaluation. But yeah, again, I don't know enough yet, but yeah, I'm keen to find out more. Thanks. Oh, I have to pass over to oh goodness, there's so many people.
Yeah.
I think we might be here for a while.
Yeah, I was going to say, shall I just sorry to interrupt there, Louise, because I was just wondering, I've it's one of those I've set the horse running and I realized actually it could take us a while. So I was wondering, just as a recap, we've something about listening to people and afterwards, PAR methods and tools, English not being a first language, a way to get more information from communities, which is interesting. One of the concerns of technology and infrastructure and the use in intergenerational projects. I wonder if anybody wanted to speak to some other interests and concerns that not been addressed so far. Apologies to cut short because I'm also got one eye on the time. Okay, perfect. Any other interests and concerns that you have, do bring them, because I now know how we can like focus the conversations when we have conversations around this, and I can open it up to a kind of popcorn style. I'm going to take my video off now. And you can see my screen. Is that just a thumbs up from someone? That would be great. You can see my screen? Okay, so I'm assuming you can see my screen. So I thought I'd just situate myself in how I've been using Photovoice. So I've used a range of different methods: participatory video, participatory theatre, participatory photography, which is called Photovoice, and citizens, juries, and so on. So I've used a range of different methodologies, and I've used Photovoice. First used it 20 years ago as a youth worker with children, and I learned the very hard way about having too many photos. So that's something we can go back to later on. So too many photos, I've been on the hard end of that. I've also used it as small charity, so a little small charity where we use Photovoice. Used it at the university, and I've teach it at master's levels for the last 5 years. So students who generally come to the master's end up knowing how to use Photovoice. So those are my ranges of different experiences of using the method, and I've used it in relation to other methods as well, so participatory theatre and video. So I'm happy to discuss how this method sits with other methods. Okay, so before I kind of go into this, I thought it'd be nice to work in groups first and what people think photo voice is, because there's a lot of different understandings of what photo voice is, and I think that's okay to have a plurality, a kind of broad church on this. But it'd be really useful if we was to split into groups and just discuss what photo voice means to you. And I was thinking maybe groups 4 or 5. What do you, Sarah? What do you think, Sarah? Groups 4 or 5?
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, brilliant. So we could do that for 5 minutes. What does photo voice mean to you? How would you kind of explain it to somebody else from as a group discussion? We're all back. Brilliant. Okay. One thing I did forget to mention was that I was hoping for one volunteer from the group to just report back and to see what we can learn from each other around photo voice. So is there anybody from the group that I was in? Yes, so is there a volunteer from the group I was in to kind of report back a little bit about the conversations?
I can just quickly whip through that, Jazz, if that's all right.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Ben.
So we were lucky to have Jazz with us because he's a facilitator, so he facilitated us. So myself, Hafiza, Callum and Libby, I work with Callum and Libby. Haven't met Callum before, so it's quite interesting. But yes, our feedback was, what's it about? True representation of what people are experiencing, trying to capture that, focus on the use of stories. And this is the development of that idea, sort of a much more meaningful and human dimension to the capturing of information. The idea that it hands ownership over to the people who are being evaluated, or people who are supposedly benefiting from an intervention or a session or a program. It gives you an opportunity to dig a bit deeper and hear more, to sort of gather extra feedback on learning and experiences, especially from those who find it less easy to communicate that feedback. Just someone saying surveys don't always work, but there is a concern that this has a tech dimension which needs to be overcome so it doesn't get in the way. Couple of questions around permissions, as Jazz called it. It's a bit of a red flag and something that has been really acknowledged, and as a response to it, looking at the need for really deep conversations about ownership, about privacy, and about permissions for use of the information. And the fact that we're talking about lived experience here. It's not about numbers. It's not always about numbers. What we're actually dealing with here is something with a level of intimacy and a sharpness and a properly situated gathering of information. I think that probably sums it up.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to add something that Hafiza said as well, which I thought was quite interesting. The challenge of funders wanting much work. So, you know, the elephant in the room, that there's a lot of pressure not to use these methods. Okay, the next group, somebody from the next group who would like to just feedback. There'll be a rush of volunteers, isn't it?
I can go for our group.
Sure.
We just thought, I guess, just along similar veins, just that it sounds like quite an exciting, without knowing too much about Photovoice just yet, just expressing our sort of frustration with surveys and form filling, and how even when you try to make those accessible to people by sitting down and reading through it with them, it's just quite boring, and it doesn't get the full picture and the full the full impact around, and how much more impactful it can be to see a photo or another more creative way of capturing people's experience of what you've sort of been through together, and just that it's better for engagement from participants. I don't know if I missed out on anything else you said, but we spoke around that mostly.
Brilliant, thank you. Anybody from that group want to add a bit more before we go on to the next group? Okay, the next group.
Anyone from my group want to report back? I can report back if my internet connection means you can hear me. We were having conversations about how it can be used as a tool to sort of pull out things from different perspectives that you might not gain from other monitoring and evaluation methods. It can give a voice to people who might be shy or not want to be so verbal. You can see their perspective through the photos. And it can also provide like a really lovely forum where all the photos are together, and it provokes some interesting discussions and can be quite thought-provoking, and can create nice dialogue around that. We sort of heard that it's like everyone was able to use the cameras and their phones, and there wasn't necessarily an accessibility issue. Jade mentioned at her event. So it worked really well. It also sounded like it could work really well outdoors, and that it was just a very sort of personal and quite human form of evaluation. And it can bring out things that other people might not notice, so you can see different perspectives and create quite an engaged audience, and yeah, see all sorts of things basically.
Brilliant, thank you. Anybody want to add anything more from? I think there's probably how many groups was there, Sarah? Was there 2 or 3 groups? Four groups.
4 groups, yeah.
So, anyone from the other group? Hopefully somebody will break.
Does anyone else from our group want to say? I feel like I forgot half of what we discussed. I can try and then you can add perhaps. But it seemed like in our group we were none of us have used Photovoice, and we're all pretty new to it, and so some people are interested in it for evaluation reasons and some for research reasons. But we kind of just felt like we needed to know more in order to really understand what is good about it and what our questions are. But yeah, someone said they wanted to use it for people who are nonverbal, and yeah, just like a more accessible way of having people engage. Anyone else from our group want to add? Rebecca or Shelley or Kat, or I can't remember the other name. Rebecca, you looked like you were saying something but muted.
I was just agreeing with you. I think that captures it.
Okay, right, so we've done that. I did the same exercise with some young people, which I really liked, and they said their Photovoice was talking through photos, knowing what's going on by looking at a photo that speaks to what is going on for you in relation to a project. So I thought that was a really nice, super interesting way, and kind of very young people's way of. I really enjoyed that discussion. Okay, so we've had a discussion about Photovoice as a group. We've had a lived experience, effectively. You know, what is our lived experience? What is our kind of initial first thoughts of Photovoice? But there is a massive body of literature I don't want to get bogged down to, because there's about 450 plus academic papers. So I'm not going to give an academic overview of Photovoice, because I don't think it's that useful. But what I wanted to draw out now is that people have been using Photovoice. It's got popular since the 1990s, and I think there's a bit of a way of it getting a bit more popular now. But it's been used for, it's got very popular since the 1990s, but it's been used way before the 1990s. So it's been used for several decades. And it arguably combines 3 kind of approaches, so documentary, feminist research, and Freirean approaches. And for those unfamiliar with Freirean approaches, it's around I think somebody already mentioned it. It creates a forum for discussion, and Photovoice does create a forum for discussion if you organize it in a particular way. And I can talk about how you organize Photovoice later. But I would say, I think one of the biggest values of Photovoice is that it does create a way for individuals in a group to talk about their lived experience, which in itself, in terms of outcome, in terms of process, creates a forum for discussion. So one of the biggest values, I think, it creates dialogue. And I think the dialogue, the photos and the methods arguably can be secondary to the dialogues. The dialogue is the most important thing. I think what it unearths is great dialogue, but the photos are not a lesser thing. It's more of it creates a huge dialogue, and I think photos do that really, really well. It's used by a range of different NGOs, and there's even NGOs that are called Photovoice, for example. They're just in Photovoice. So there's a long tradition, which I'm basically trying to say. But for me, and this is where the concepts, I'm going to just introduce a few concepts. I think that the concepts behind it are really, really important as well. And how I got interested in it was around this idea of decolonizing knowledge. So historically, what we have is a knowledge system that has been quite colonial. And I've just got a message saying my internet is unstable, so hopefully you can hear me. Is that there was this great book, but there's others as well, called Orientalism, which kind of showed very well that research historically was always done through a colonial lens. So knowledge in itself and research in itself was a way of producing colonial knowledge. And the stories and the narratives around anthropology and history and so on were always colonial. So I think what Photovoice does is lean into that history of that colonized process. And it has relevance today as well in terms of how NGOs do it, how academics do it. And I think the way it does it, and this has massive impact for evaluation, is this diagram on here, which is on the left. You have a triangle, and what you have historically, you have a researcher who uses a method and then observes the researcher as an object. So the research becomes the research becomes an object, and this is in colonial times, but also happens in modern times as well. And then the researcher does the analysis and the narrative. So you have this kind of pyramid model, this kind of triangle model, where the researcher sits at the top and then is at the apex of the research process, and narrates for the research, for the object of the research. And I think what Photovoice does, which belongs to a kind of tradition of participatory action research, which we can talk to later. So it's creative methods are part of participatory action research. It provides a different model to the kind of pyramid. And this is a bit more circular, to say, the way I've kind of described it as circular. So you the method and the research participants, the subjects, sit side by side in a circle, and the narrative is generated through the participants, through the method, and the research is part of that process. Is part of that process rather than separate at the apex. So the research is part of that process, part of that horizontal / circular model of research. So what does this mean for evaluations? Well, what it means for evaluations is that you don't necessarily need to produce a report. You could have an evaluation which is much more embodied. And I appreciate everybody needs a report because funders need reports. But the key thing is that the knowledge that is created creates the narrative. And then that narrative can be used to create actions. So that actions could be a report, or it could be, let's redesign the project, or let's think about what we would do differently next time. So you use embodied knowledge to drive and generate an action which can get into that circular model of research, that circular model of building knowledge and building perspectives together. So I think that's the kind of key concept that I think photo voice can do, but you could argue, and I do argue, that other methods can do the same as well, because it's about how you organize the research. But photo voice has some real kind of real advantages. It also has a radical history. So I first came across, well, the first readings I actually just did it on the off chance, but Paolo Freire, who wrote Pedagogue of the Oppressed, looked at photo voice in a very different way. So in 1976, he asked the people he was working with, adult learners, to take photos of the exploitation that they were facing. And I thought this was a really powerful, radical approach on what research can be. And to take photos of the exploitation you're facing is another way of saying take photos of the oppression and the exploitation you're facing, so that exploitation and oppression can be overturned. So there's also a very radical history to photo voice, which I think is worth mentioning, worth thinking about on its history. Okay. So photo voice, I think, has a radical history, but has a social science history, also has an NGO history, has many different ways. But I think what it symbolically does, it places cameras into the hands of people with the lived experience to narrate themselves. And I think that's the strongest kind of value or objective of photo voice. It's about who gets to narrate. So the reason I kind of brought up diagram before is that the researcher typically gets to narrate rather than the person with the lived experience. And this symbolically, by putting cameras into the hands of others, people take the photos and thereby tell their story. So the researcher is very much a facilitator rather than at the apex of the triangle narrating the subject. And I think that's really, really important. And what photo voice does, it effectively seizes power around the space, around the method, and the power to self-document. So photo voice is leaning in to power relations, and I think that's one of the key concepts, one of the key values. And I'll talk about some of the limitations of that seizing power later on. And the self-analysis for evaluations rather than an expert from above. And I think this displaces the idea that you do an evaluation that goes into a report that stays onto a shelf. It's actually about people really evaluating for themselves what they enjoyed about the project, what they didn't enjoy about the project, and what they want to see changed. So I think it really shifts some of the power relations. And we can talk about some of the limits because funders want reports, so we can talk about some of that limits in a moment. Okay, so some of the kind of key concepts around creative methods per se, it displaces the objective research, and I think that's healthy, and that it allows other knowledges, other perspectives to be around the table, and hence that circle, that other perspectives get to narrate. So as a researcher or as an NGO worker or project officer, depending on your title, wherever it is, it's a good way of giving up a space of knowing. So rather than you becoming the knower, the knowing is pushed on, not pushed onto, is opened up into a democratic way, and it's the people with the lived experience. It also gives up this idea that communication is linear. So it's between the researcher and the researched. It's actually a dialogue. So you're creating a dialogue, and I think that's a really powerful thing to give up, is that communication is linear. I appreciate that this training is quite linear, but that's it's because we're online. It also gives up the singular interpretation idea that there's one perspective. With photo voice, it becomes abundantly clear there's a plurality of perspectives, and with photos you have that documentations where that's not always so clear. And one of the things I think is really good, it also gives up the idea that the written word is the most powerful. Something about a photo can explain a photo can explain quite clearly what's going on. It can also be quite abstract, and then you have to interpret that. So it gives up some of the written words. It's a great way of looking at exploitation and oppression. So there is a radical tradition to this as well. And again, it really unearths and it really allows for embodied knowledge. So it's not a knowledge of analysis that comes from elsewhere. It's the knowledge that people have about their own experiences. And that own experiences can turn into a learning and action cycle. So what happens afterwards, I think, is one of the key issues that came up in the introductions, and the what can happen afterwards. I think there's lots of things that can happen afterwards, but action is one of the things that can happen afterwards, and that's done collectively. And I can talk a bit more about that. Okay, so I think it's time to break up my voice. And so I would like us to go into groups with this Jamboard and to think about, you've heard a bit about Photovoice, what do you think of the positive things and the limitations as well? And then we can open up that discussion about positives and limitations. And we can address some of the questions that came up in a group. So I've noted some of the concerns that you had with at the beginning of the session. So I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll get that Jamboard link. Just give me 2 seconds.
And apologies for my internet. It's just one of those things. It's been fine until today. It's my first experience really of it not working properly. Okay, I'll just get back into it because I'm very conscious of time. So I just hope everybody gets back. So these are the this is the Jamboard. Hopefully you can all see that. Does anybody want to speak from group 1 about some of the positives and limitations intuitively, as they intuitively feel? Group 1. Anybody in group 1?
Are we group 1?
Okay,
We might be group 1. We didn't actually make many posters. We had a good chat, but we didn't make many posters.
Any kind of what were your kind of top line discussions? Anything you want to report back, Jade, from group 1?
Can I add from the group, which was that we don't really know much about the process, and I'm sure that's going to come, but until we know how it works, it's difficult to know you know, what some of the limitations might be. I think some of the positives were around how visual and how instant the impact would be, but it depends a little bit on how you steer it.
Yeah, of course.
I'm talking a little bit to my own thoughts there, and I put them on the board, but others may have other things to say.
Yeah.
I think one thing that that came up with something Jade said was around how useful it can be for like opening up the feedback. So you're not leading participants to give you as a researcher the feedback that you want to hear. It's like can be really open-ended. And then one of the fears or the limitations that was brought up was that, oh, does that mean that people might end up going on a bit of a tangent? You know, that's about something that's maybe not as related to the activity or the project.
Yeah.
But then maybe that's interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, definitely a tension there, isn't it? Definitely a tension and starting points as well. And what's the starting point of the project? And we can talk a bit more about the process in a moment. Okay, thank you. How about group 2? Anything from group 2? How about group 3?
I have to confess, I don't know what number group I was.
Go ahead anyway.
Feel free to just...
So I want to drop Thomas in it because he had the most interesting things to say. Are you there, Thomas?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, we got talking about your colonial attitude to research and how that still carries on very much. And that's very much an experience living in the Outer Hebrides, where we've lived for 20 years now. And it's amazing how much extractive research is conducted. And this is a way of putting the power in the hands of those taking the photos. And it's, you know, for them to determine what emerges from that, and then if there is a researcher who does have to report, well, it's for the researcher to work out how they use that material to report to a funder. But for the community, it's around what comes next, what are the actions, where they want to go. So I think that can be really powerful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Thomas. Okay, any more comments from that group? Anybody from the other group? I appreciate we don't know which group was 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Well, we can come back to the limitations. We can have a more broader discussion about this, because I appreciate it's a bit abstract. So what I can do, I can go into some of the process itself and take it from there. I should be sharing my screen. Okay, so more generically, the positives, as you've all experienced, is about who has the power to tell the story. And one of the other benefits of it is very cost effective and simple. But maybe what I'll do, I'll go through some of my processes where I've used it, because I think one of the feedbacks is it's a bit abstract. So what I can do is go into my some of the doing of Photovoice and how it's been done, and then we can look at some of the positives and limitations. So the doing of Photovoice for me is very much a process. So even for evaluations and non-evaluations, so this is more generic for evaluations and non-evaluations. And I think this is an interesting thing about starting points and about power relations. And Thomas, I think, yeah, the Outer Hebrides is a great example, but also across a range of different communities. It's how is the project started? How is the Photovoice process started? So like any good collaborative project, it actually starts by working in collaboration, in partnerships with the communities you're working with. So if it starts from a community collaborative partnership, some of the questions around tangents and whether it's going in the right direction or not, those become less important, because the framing and the way that the process starts is actually very much embedded in the collaborative process. The other thing that I think is absolutely essential for doing came up about permissions is having a thorough informed consent process. Without an informed consent process, I don't think you should ever do Photovoice. I think it's one of those methods that I think carries a big red flag, but I think many methods carry a big red flag. And I think the big red flag is that, you know, whose faces should be revealed and who shouldn't be revealed. And I think because there's sensitivities around that, the informed consent process needs to be much more given quite a lot of attention to. If there is informed consent, and generally there is, I think it's absolutely crucial to organize a process of Photovoice. So I've done Photovoice processes that have lasted up to 6 months and a bit longer, in honesty. It actually took 8 months. I don't know why I put 6 months there. So 8 months process of Photovoice. So that is meeting pretty much every week with a few processes in between. And we did Photovoice over 8 months effectively. And I've also done Photovoice events that just last for 1 day. But nonetheless, you have to organize a process depending on the kind of community collaborative partnership you got. One of the things also is around creating a space for dialogue. So it's not just taking the photo, taking and to socialize and collectivize that knowledge that's being created, because we are knowledge creators. People who take photos are knowledge creators, and to view them as knowledge creators, I think, is really, really important. Another thing you can do in the Photovoice process, and this is You can do it or you don't do it. That's entirely up to you. Is you can get a professional photographer in. That's completely up to you. It's the budgets, etc., etc. And then another thing you can do, and I've done this a few times, is to have an exhibition of the photos you have. And this can be really powerful if you're talking about an oppression in society. And so, for example, I was doing some work on, and I can talk about that a little bit later, is that you have an exhibition to amplify the voice of the community, or to amplify the voice around a particular issue, around a campaign or something. So exhibitions can be part of a campaign, or it can be about amplifying voice. It really depends on the community collaborative project. And with that exhibition, the thing that I've noticed, the exhibitions go up and then they go down. So one of the things I've started to do now, and the last project, was to create an ebook. So there's a permanent exhibition, and that permanent exhibition can be mobilized to MPs and so on and so forth if we're a particular. So here's some examples, because I appreciate everybody's feeling a bit abstract around this. And I did this in it was a funded project when I wasn't an academic. So I was working at a small equalities organization called the Inclusion Project, Greenwich Inclusion Project. And I was looking at a focus on the new migrant group. And what the reason we worked on this was because they're outdoor, the Nepalese community in Southeast London, in Woolwich, were outdoors a lot. And some of the narratives around why the Nepalese communities were outdoors a lot were the same narratives that were used for other communities back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that narrative was that their sons are outdoors a lot. So a race equality organization where I was working before, we found this unusual that narrative was still coming across. And how do we challenge that narrative? And so, working alongside academics, we developed a participatory photography Photovoice project, where we did 12 workshops with elders and some elders who came to ESOL. Is a way to do English. But we also did workshops with people who wouldn't come to ESOL classes. So, for example, people who are illiterate. So we went to the local common to work with the Nepalese community there. And then we built actions around this. And to give you just a bit of a flavor, this is where it was done. So this is where the community was gathering, and this is where the narratives and those kind of stereotypes about the community were occurring, and the stereotypes were the local authority, etc., etc. So you can see groups gathering here, and there's a groups that used to gather in the Plumstead Common. So what we did was to work with the Nepalese community. It was mainly women, but it's a mixed group, mainly all elders, who didn't speak English very well, who didn't read and write English very well. So Photovoice was a really good method in explaining their narratives. So we joined the ESOL class to work with the community. And so we did ESOL as well, and then also did photography in this process. So they'll come and take photos of their lives every week over a 12-week period, and they would report back of their photos in this kind of forum, this kind of space. But because I was concerned that the people here had some level of literacy, how would illiterate, what was happening to Nepalese elders who were illiterate? And there was a group that used to gather in the common. It's this group who didn't come to the ESOL class because they had illiteracy in their own languages as well. So we taught Photovoice here. And so you can see you can develop a Photovoice process quite quickly outdoors without an infrastructure like classrooms and so on and so forth, or seminar rooms. You can do it outside. It's quite easy to do that. And so we trained, we provided cameras to the elders so they could learn about photography and how to take photos. This group wasn't so familiar with taking photos. It was some years before mobile phones became normal. So they started to learn about how to take photos. We did have a photographer, and I can talk about that a bit more later, whether you have one or not. And then we started to analyze some of the issues that were coming up. and they wanted to get their voice across into an exhibition, and there's an exhibition that we did. And you can see the quality of the exhibition there. It's on pieces of card and so on. So it's a very low budget. And the issues, I don't want to go into too much because it's not about that, but there's a range of issues that came out that I thought were quite interesting, that came out because we had a longer process around lived experiences. And some of the actions that came out were very much linked to this, and having the photos really helped communicate this to the local authorities. So the local authority came to this exhibition, and loads of NGOs that were local came to the exhibition. Issue, we had solicitors around housing and immigration come see the community because of the issues that came out of the Photovoice exhibitions. But I'm not going to go into too many details because I'm worried about time. And then we did another exhibition to look at food insecurity for no recourse to public funds. Again, that was done around in the experience of the community who had no recourse to public funds and immigration condition. That means you can't have access to social protection. And there was a range of added value that we observed through that process. So we met on Zoom for about 6 to about 8 months. So it was the 8-month project, and taking photos the experiences of living with no recourse to public funds. And just to fast forward because of time, there's obviously a bigger budget in this project. So it's we managed to get a gallery in East London. You can see the campaign as well. So this was very much an exhibition to create a campaign to abolish no recourse to public funds. And here you can see how the experience were put into a gallery. You can see the photos there with narratives. Much, there's a bigger budget, so there's much more professionally looking, although it doesn't have to be like that in my experience, as long as it gets the message across. But this is just universities just attract more money. So when I was working at an NGO, we'd have much less funds, and as a youth worker, we had no funds. So it's just a privilege that academia brings. You can see the exhibition in action. And there's some, and then we had a launch event. That's my overly marked there. And now what we're doing with the next steps is an ebook. So the exhibition is permanent, and we sending that ebook to MPs, the UN, and creating a policy paper and thinking through next steps about how to abolish no recourse to public funds. So it's a much more simple project in many ways. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I thought it might be a good time now to just invite some generic conversation around Photovoice because of the time. I'm thinking about positives and limitations. I'm just wondering whether you had any kind of first thoughts around limitations and positives, or any questions just in a table approach for now, because I'm worried about the time. Any kind of first thoughts about Photovoice in relation to some of the examples I've given?
Is it okay to ask a question?
Yeah, please do. Yes, please.
So if the you mentioned a photographer at one point taking the photos.
Yeah.
How would that work in terms of my understanding of the process is that usually it's the participants themselves that take the photos. Maybe, for example, in our situation with the community cookery classes, they might be a bit too focused in on the cookery itself, and if they wanted to kind of use it as a way of analyzing the sessions, if a photographer was to come in and then take photos, and then the photos were showed to the group and they decided which one's best documented their experience, would that still kind of fall under this?
It's a good question, and generally, so I just wanted to clarify, the photographer came in to train us about aesthetics of the photos. So one of the things I noticed in my earlier projects of doing Photovoice is that some of the aesthetics of the photos weren't, I mean, you can't really judge an aesthetics of the photos, but I thought that was quite interesting, really. I'm thinking about how photography as an art form tells a story. So the aesthetics, the lighting, and so on. So we had a photographer come in to help us think about lighting, aesthetics, and so on, rather than the photographer taking the photos themselves.
Okay.
So I think a really big thing around this is that the lens, the gaze, so to speak, the jargon is that the gaze remains in the hands of the photographer, the person who's taking the photo, the person with the lived experience. So it's their gaze always.
Yeah.
But what you can do is bring a photographer in to help us think about the aesthetics. So, you know, the photography is poetry, photography is art, and how can we develop our art form as well? So that's the reason. And I think that's something you can do or not do. It's not critical, it's not vital. I don't think it's a red line. In many ways, some people think you don't need that at all. But I just think it's sometimes okay to bring art and documentary together. I think it's a nice thing to do. So it's an optional extra which you may or may not want to do. I don't have a firm line whether you should do it or not. I think in general it's the budget that speaks, to be honest, because you know the photographers charge quite a lot, to be honest.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, no problem. Any other kind of questions or concerns, or think about positives and limitations? Yes, please, Ben.
Just ask if you've used video as well as still photography, and if there's additional things that you need to consider when you're doing that.
Yes, I have used video, not recently, but I've used video quite a bit. And this is a really interesting question about accessibility and cost. And one of the reasons I've moved to Photovoice, especially when I was working in the community sector, less so in academia because there's a lot more money around, was that video is actually more expensive because you need editing equipment, you need quite a lot of professional skill, although that's changing. And so you often have to get a participatory video in because they have all the editing stuff that I just don't have. So but there's real positives about using a video, so you can really tell a story, you can really meditate on one aspect of the story. And I've used video with young people and they love it. They really enjoy making videos. So but you do need a bigger budget, so that's something in terms of infrastructure. Jade?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a little side thing really, but one of the things that I noticed when we did a Photovoice with a farm day was people learning things about each other that knew each other quite well.
Yes.
Like someone was just saying how proud they were of their teenager who was there, or they were talking about how much they liked the project worker, or saying things about the day, you know, and like the project workers were going, oh, I knew this person really well and I never knew what agrophotography was, or I never knew she knew about how to grow vegetables. So it was good. I like that about it.
Yeah, the dialogue, it's kind of snap and chat, I call it, in a very simple way. It's and young people are there as well, you know, it's kind of a bit of snap and chat. That's pretty much what happens. So as a youth worker, I was doing a lot of Photovoice, and we weren't producing reports because the main objective was to create those dialogues, to get to know each other in a safe way, in a facilitated way. So that dialogue is absolutely one of the biggest outcomes of Photovoice. I've got Beth and then Amy.
I was just wondering about kind of the process between like taking photos and then if you were exhibiting them, if you had a particular kind of strategy for people, like if there are a lot of photos for people deciding together which photos they want to use. Yes,
so I can tell you my arc of the journey. So back in the day when I was a youth worker, I'd give disposable cameras to young people and you'd get 20, I think it was like 30 odd photos, and it was very manageable. When you move it to mobile phones, so now I don't even give cameras out because most people have mobile phones, and if somebody doesn't, then I have a camera that I give to people. But most people just use their phone, and most people, regardless of their budget, generally have a phone. But if they don't, then you have digital exclusion does happen. It's very real, so it's worth having digital cameras as well. with digital cameras, what happens, and with the mobile phone, you can get hundreds of photos, and that's happened to me. So now I limit it to 1 photo per week or 3 photos per project, etc., etc. And it all depends on the numbers of people as well. So you do have to limit it. So I spend a lot of time thinking about framing the question around what we're trying to look at together. So, for example, the lived experience of no recourse to public funds and immigration condition. We looked at the impact of that, and very narrowly, as in, you know, how it kind of just that, so not everything else. And we limited it to 3 photos each, take 3 photos, but report back with 2. So at least you didn't have to just come up with 1, because it becomes too much to manage. Actually, it's just too much. It's too much. And the discussions can last for too long. So, and I've learned the hard way. So you do have to put a limit around that. I can't like advise what the limit is, because it depends. Like a group, you know, you can be a bit more creative, but we had a group of 20, and then that becomes a bit too much. Does that answer your question, Beth, or kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I can see it kind of depends on group size, doesn't it, I guess, and
Yes.
what time you have.
Yeah. Amy?
Thanks.
No worries. I think Amy wanted.
Hi, yeah. Yeah, I think I was wondering about like how funders, you know, respond to this, like how, you know, like yeah, how well do funders who want sort of certain kind of monitoring and evaluation done, like how, you know, how you convince them? And yeah, I guess Jeannie, yeah, and I guess like how it works into sort of funding applications. Like I guess you sort of said like with cameras, you most people have their most people have mobile phones now, but yeah, it's just like wondering like, yeah, what is your experience with sort of like how receptive big funders are to this, big or small funders?
Yeah, so in terms of budgeting for Photovoice, I find it one of the cheapest participatory methods. So if this video is very expensive, are expensive, Photovoice is much cheaper, and you just have to budget for the exclusion. For funders, I'm going to ask Jade, because I think funders are a mixed bag. So
I can only talk about the lottery, and they were brilliant. In fact, I just noticed, I think maybe she's gone now, but our grants officer I just noticed was on the call. And for our previous grants officer, I don't actually know whether he was typical of all of the grants officers at the community fund, but he was fantastic. And I was quite openly, you know, self-critical of having produced this very expensive report that didn't result in much change in practice on the last project. And he was really engaged in that conversation. And I don't know, I think we probably make a lot of assumptions about what funders want. And when we made the application for this project, we just talked really straight about what they wanted from the evaluation, and it wasn't what you might have imagined. They were very engaged and interested. It wasn't a problem. I think we're too frightened of what funders want. I think just ask them what they really need. That's my opinion.
I was just going to say, we're just about to kick off a lottery project about behaviour change and working with groups that aren't normally engaging in community growing. So so this could be really interesting for that. And actually the kind of feedback that we're getting from the lottery around monitoring evaluation is they don't really want big reports. They're more interested in the behaviour change, and that's easier to kind of discuss through this kind of approach. So I think there does seem to be movement from the lottery. So I think I hadn't come across this before, so I'm going to be discussing this with our officer, and I've seen him in a couple of weeks before we start delivery. So Jade, if there's any if I do get any pushback, then I'd appreciate a name from you about who might be best to say, oh, this has happened in the past and it's gone down well.
Alison, I'll put my email in the chat, and if you want to chat, you're welcome to do.
Thank you. Any other kind of, yeah. Just wanted to kind of say some of the concerns were around and that I didn't get a chance to speak to was around technology and infrastructure. And I think actually you don't need a huge amount of technology and infrastructure, so I think it's actually quite inclusive on that, and not fully inclusive, but quite inclusive. And then the other thing, the permission I think is really, really important. The informed consent I think is absolutely central to this method. And then the other thing, there are situations where photo voice needs to be done quite smartly, especially around children, around and children. You know, you take a photo of a child, you do need the permission of their parents. So you really have to think about some of the ethical issues around that. And then obviously working with undocumented migrants in a country that is incredibly hostile to migrants, you can't be revealing identity. So you really need to think carefully about some of these things when you're doing photo voice projects. And I think that collaboration is really, really important from the onset, is that you know, there's hostility in this country, so you have to really, really think about how you take these photos. And I think that's something really does need a lot of informed consent around. Any other final thoughts and reflections? I've gone 5 minutes over time, which is good. Normally 1 hour over time, so that's some progression in my training.
Can I just ask if you have a guide to the process that you use, you know, the sort of how you pose a question that the photos respond to, how you contain things a little bit at the beginning? Do you say, take a, Jade said that you said in her experience, you just say, take photos of whatever you want to, rather than steering it or guiding it at all? Or do you have a rule of thumb about how you do that?
Yeah, the rule of thumb, I think, is working closely with the community. One way is open framed questions, as in you really openly framed, discuss your lived experience. And I start off with that generally, and then I narrow down a little bit. So take, for example, take pictures of your lived experience, but then also take pictures of the lived experience of, say, for example, how immigration policies are affecting you, or, for example, on how youth services are affecting you, or something. So that really depends on the group you're working on, but it's that's a bit of an art, I think. But I haven't seen a guide on that, and maybe I should write one. But I'll probably, you know, trip myself up writing on that one. It's always a complicated. It's the art versus the science, isn't it? Sometimes I think it's really, you have to lean into how the group wants you to lean into it. So, you know, and the other thing is the group comes up with questions as well, which I think is quite useful. Any other thoughts and feelings before we head off? I'm conscious time, so I don't want to keep you here any longer.
I think we better just thank you, Jas, for sharing your views and making it so accessible for everybody. Yeah, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Very
Thank you. Thank you. I've really enjoyed doing this. My first time giving a full photo voice training, so thank you for being patient. So thank you. And yeah, get my email if you just want to talk about this a bit more. Feel free to give me an email, and I can hopefully follow up with anything.